Have you ever been in a relationship where you found yourself walking on eggshells, measuring every word, every gesture, every breath, because you knew that one wrong move could set off an explosion? Where you became so small, so careful, that you barely recognized the person staring back at you in the mirror? If you're watching this from somewhere that feels unsafe, know that what happens next could change everything. Sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places, in the most dangerous packages. The crystal stemware caught the light from the restaurant's chandeliers as Isabella Chun lifted her wine glass with trembling fingers. She hadn't wanted to come to Meridian tonight. The upscale Italian restaurant in downtown Chicago was far beyond her budget, with its white tablecloths and gold-leafed ceiling, but Marcus had insisted. He always insisted, and she had learned that resistance only made things worse. At 25, Isabella should have been enjoying her life, building her graphic design career, laughing with friends over weekend brunches. Instead, she sat across from Marcus Hoffman, watching his jaw tighten as he scrolled through his phone, his displeasure radiating across the intimate table for two like heat from a furnace. She knew that look, had learned to read every micro-expression, every shift in his posture, every change in his breathing pattern. It was a survival skill she'd never wanted to develop. The restaurant hummed with quiet conversation and the gentle clink of silverware against porcelain. Other couples seemed relaxed, laughing softly, sharing bites of their entrees. Isabella envied them their ease, their obvious comfort with each other. She couldn't remember the last time she'd felt comfortable anywhere, especially not with Marcus. "You're being paranoid," she told herself, the familiar mantra that had become her constant companion over the past 8 months. "He's just had a stressful day at the law firm. He's taking you somewhere nice. Stop looking for problems." But her body knew better than her mind. Her shoulders remained rigid despite her attempts to relax. Her stomach churned despite the expensive Italian cuisine, and her hands shook no matter how tightly she gripped her napkin. Her body had been keeping score long before her mind was ready to acknowledge the tally. Marcus looked up from his phone, his pale blue eyes scanning her face with the intensity of a prosecutor examining a hostile witness. At 31, he was successful, ambitious, and knew how to present himself as the perfect boyfriend when it mattered. Tonight, in his tailored navy suit and expensive watch, he looked like exactly the kind of man her mother would approve of. Stable, successful, safe. The irony wasn't lost on her. "What's wrong with your face?" he said without preamble, his voice low but carrying that edge she'd learned to fear. "You look like someone died." "Nothing's wrong," Isabella replied automatically, forcing her lips into what she hoped resembled a smile. "I was just thinking about the presentation I have tomorrow." His expression darkened further. "I told you not to bring work to dinner. Can't you focus on anything other than that pathetic little job of yours for 5 minutes?" The criticism hit like a physical blow, even though she should have been used to it by now. Her graphic design work wasn't pathetic. She was talented, creative, and had been slowly building a client base before Marcus had started undermining her confidence at every turn. But arguing would only make things worse, so she nodded and took another sip of wine instead. "Sorry," she whispered. "You're right." The apology seemed to mollify him slightly, and he returned his attention to his phone. Isabella let her gaze wander around the restaurant, taking in the warm lighting and elegant decor. That's when she noticed him. 3 tables away, a man sat alone, his dark hair perfectly styled, his black suit clearly custom-made. Even seated, she could tell he was tall and powerfully built, with the kind of presence that seemed to command attention without effort. But it wasn't his obvious wealth or striking appearance that caught her attention. It was the way he was watching their table. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, gray-green and intense, and they were fixed not on her, but on Marcus. There was something in his expression that made her pulse quicken, though she couldn't quite identify what. Not attraction, exactly, though he was undeniably handsome. Something more dangerous than that. Something that made her think of predators studying their prey. She looked away quickly, not wanting to be caught staring, but she could feel his gaze like a physical weight. Who was he? And why was he watching them with such focused intensity? Marcus's voice cut through her wandering thoughts like a blade. "Are you even listening to me?" Isabella's attention snapped back to her boyfriend, her heart rate spiking with familiar anxiety. "Sorry, what did you say?" His face had gone red, the way it always did when his temper started to rise. The carefully controlled mask he wore in public was beginning to slip, revealing something uglier underneath. I was telling you about the partners' dinner next week. You're coming with me, and you're going to wear that black dress I bought you. The one that actually makes you look presentable. The insult stung, but Isabella had learned not to react visibly to his verbal jabs. The black dress he was referring to was conservative to the point of being matronly, high-necked and long-sleeved, more suitable for a funeral than a dinner party. But Marcus preferred her covered up, unremarkable, invisible. It made it easier for him to control the narrative about who she was and what their relationship looked like. Of course, she said quietly, whatever you think is best. But apparently, even that level of compliance wasn't enough tonight. Marcus leaned forward, his voice dropping to a hiss that wouldn't carry to the neighboring tables, but would reach her ears with perfect clarity. You've been acting strange all week. Distracted. Secretive. If I find out you're talking to that pathetic sister of yours again, or any of those so-called friends who tried to poison you against me, there will be consequences. Do you understand me? Isabella's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't spoken to her sister Lily in 3 months, not since Marcus had convinced her that Lily was jealous of their relationship and trying to sabotage it. She hadn't contacted any of her old friends either, mostly because Marcus had systematically isolated her from them over the course of their relationship, making her feel guilty every time she wanted to maintain those connections. I understand, she said, though her voice came out smaller than she'd intended. Good, Marcus said, his smile returning but never reaching his eyes. Because you know how much I hate being disappointed. The threat hung in the air between them, unspoken but clearly understood. Isabella had learned what Marcus's disappointment looked like. The silent treatment that could last for days. The withdrawal of affection and basic kindness. The way he would systematically destroy her confidence with carefully chosen words designed to make her feel worthless, stupid, lucky that he put up with her at all. She reached for her wine glass again, needing something to do with her hands, but misjudged the distance and knocked over the salt shaker instead. The small ceramic container hit the table with a sharp crack, scattering coarse sea salt across the white tablecloth. The sound seemed to echo in the sudden silence that fell over their table. Isabella watched in horror as Marcus's face transformed, the careful public mask finally slipping away entirely. His eyes went cold, his jaw clenched so tightly she could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin, and when he spoke, his voice carried a promise that made her blood run to ice. You're done when we get home. For words that contained a world of threat. Isabella's hands began to shake in earnest now, and she clasped them together in her lap to hide the tremor. She knew what those words meant. Had experienced Marcus's particular brand of punishment before, though never quite this public in its delivery. The elegant restaurant suddenly felt like a cage, the warm lighting oppressive instead of romantic. Isabella's throat tightened, making it difficult to swallow, difficult to breathe. She wanted to disappear, to sink through the floor and escape the weight of Marcus's fury and the growing attention their table was attracting from nearby diners. That's when she heard the voice. Deep, smooth, with just a hint of an accent that suggested Italian heritage. Excuse me, but I couldn't help but notice your beautiful companion seemed distressed. Isabella looked up to find the dark-haired stranger standing beside their table, his imposing presence even more striking up close. He had to be at least 6 foot tall, with broad shoulders that filled out his expensive suit perfectly, and those storm-gray eyes were now focused entirely on Marcus with an intensity that made the air around their table feel charged with electricity. Marcus's head snapped up, his expression shifting from anger to outrage in the span of a heartbeat. I'm sorry, do we know you? The stranger's smile was polite, but didn't warm his eyes at all. Dante Romano, he said, extending his hand in a gesture that somehow managed to be both courteous and vaguely threatening. I own several establishments in this area. I make it my business to ensure that all our guests feel safe and comfortable during their dining experience. There was something in the way he said the word safe that made Isabella's pulse quicken for entirely different reasons than Marcus's threats. Something that suggested this wasn't just about customer service or restaurant hospitality. This was about something much more personal, much more dangerous. Marcus ignored the extended hand, his face flushing an even deeper shade of red. We're having a private conversation. I'd appreciate it if you'd mind your own business. Dante Romano's expression didn't change, but somehow the temperature around their table seemed to drop several degrees. In my experience, private conversations don't typically involve threats of violence against women. Perhaps you'd like to reconsider your choice of words. The restaurant had gone quiet around them, other diners pretending not to watch while hanging on every word of the exchange. Isabella felt caught between terror and something that might have been hope, though she didn't dare identify it as such. No one had ever stood up for her before. No one had ever challenged Marcus when he showed his true colors. Marcus started to stand, his chest puffing out like a bantam rooster preparing for a fight. "Now look here, you have no right to." Dante Romano moved then, just a single step closer to their table, but somehow that small movement contained enough menace to stop Marcus mid-sentence. The older man's hand came to rest on the back of Isabella's chair, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, close enough that his presence felt like a shield between her and Marcus's escalating anger. "I think," Dante said in that same deceptively calm voice, "that the lady might benefit from some fresh air. The evening is quite lovely, and the stress of dinner conversation seems to have affected her appetite." It wasn't really a suggestion. There was something in his tone, in the way he carried himself, in the subtle but unmistakable authority he projected, that made it clear this was more of a directive than a request. Isabella found herself looking up at him, really seeing him for the first time. His face was strong and angular, with a straight nose that suggested aristocratic breeding and a mouth that could probably be devastating when he chose to smile. But it was his eyes that captured her attention. Despite the danger she sensed in him, despite the obvious threat he posed to Marcus, when he looked down at her, those storm-gray eyes were surprisingly gentle. "What do you say?" he asked her directly, his voice softer now, more coaxing than commanding. "Would you like to step outside for a few minutes? I have a feeling the fresh air might do you some good." Isabella's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized what he was really asking. This wasn't about fresh air or escaping the stuffiness of the restaurant. This was about escape, pure and simple. This dangerous, beautiful stranger was offering her a way out, at least temporarily, from the prison of fear she'd been living in for months. But the thought of defying Marcus, even with protection, even with a way out, terrified her almost as much as staying did. She'd learned to be small, to be compliant, to avoid making waves at all costs. The idea of standing up, of walking away, of choosing her own safety over his control, felt impossible. "She doesn't want to go anywhere with you," Marcus snarled, finally finding his voice again. "Isabella, sit down and stop making a scene." But Dante Romano's attention never wavered from her face. "The choice is yours," he said quietly, and there was something in his voice that made her believe he meant it. "No one else gets to make this decision for you." For a moment, the restaurant faded away. The watching diners, the clinking of silverware, the low hum of conversation, even Marcus's labored breathing, all of it disappeared until there was nothing but those gray-green eyes and the impossible choice they represented. Stay and face whatever punishment Marcus had planned for her perceived defiance. Continue living in fear, walking on eggshells, becoming smaller and smaller until there was nothing left of the person she used to be. Or go. Trust this stranger who radiated danger and power, but had shown her more protection in 5 minutes than Marcus had in 8 months. Step into the unknown and risk everything for the possibility of something better. Isabella's hand trembled as she reached for her purse. The movement felt surreal, like watching someone else's life unfold from a great distance. She could hear Marcus calling her name, could hear the anger and disbelief in his voice, but she couldn't seem to make herself care anymore. Standing on unsteady legs, she looked up at Dante Romano and nodded once. His smile then was devastating, transforming his austere features into something warm and encouraging and infinitely protective. "Excellent choice," he said, offering her his arm with old-world courtesy. "Shall we?" As they walked toward the restaurant's entrance, Isabella could feel Marcus's furious gaze burning into her back, could hear him calling her name with increasing desperation and rage. Part of her wanted to turn back, to apologize, to return to the familiar hell of her relationship because at least it was known. But Dante Romano's presence beside her was steady and strong, and for the first time in months, Isabella Chun felt like she might be able to breathe again. The cool Chicago evening air hit her face as they stepped outside, and she realized she was crying. Not from sadness or fear, though both emotions were still there, but from something that felt dangerously close to relief. The black Maserati gleamed under the streetlights like something from a movie, all sleek lines and expensive curves that probably cost more than Isabella made in 2 years. Dante Romano held the passenger door open for her with the same old-world courtesy he'd shown in the restaurant. But now, away from the safety of public scrutiny, the reality of what she'd just done began to sink in. She'd left Marcus, actually walked away from him in front of dozens of witnesses, with a complete stranger no less. The magnitude of her defiance felt simultaneously liberating and terrifying, like jumping off a cliff without knowing if there was water below. "Are you having second thoughts?" Dante asked quietly, his hand still resting on the car door. "Because you can still go back. I'll walk you to the restaurant entrance and disappear. No questions asked." The offer was genuine. She could hear it in his voice. But Isabella found herself shaking her head before she could think too hard about the wisdom of her choice. Whatever Dante Romano represented, whatever dangers might come with accepting his protection, they couldn't be worse than what waited for her back at Marcus's apartment. "No," she said, her voice stronger than she'd expected. "I'm not going back." Something shifted in his expression then, a flash of what might have been approval or respect, and he nodded once before helping her into the passenger seat. The leather was buttery soft beneath her hands, and the interior smelled like expensive cologne and something indefinably masculine that made her pulse quicken despite everything. As they pulled into Chicago traffic, Isabella stared out the window at the familiar streets rushing past, trying to process the surreal turn her evening had taken. An hour ago, she'd been counting down the minutes until she could escape Marcus's scrutiny and hide in the relative safety of sleep. Now she was speeding through downtown Chicago with a man who radiated danger and power in equal measure, a man whose last name had sounded vaguely familiar in a way that made her stomach flutter with nervous energy. Romano. Where had she heard that name before? "You're shaking," Dante observed, his voice gentle despite the underlying steel she could sense in him. "Are you cold?" Isabella looked down at her hands and realized he was right. Despite the car's warmth, tremors were running through her body in waves, aftershocks from the adrenaline of confronting Marcus and walking away. She'd never done anything remotely that bold before, had spent months learning to make herself smaller and quieter and more accommodating. "I'm okay," she said automatically, then caught herself. "Actually, no, I'm not okay. I'm scared and confused and I don't know what I'm doing." The honesty surprised them both. Isabella had gotten so used to giving the expected response, the one that would avoid conflict or criticism, that admitting her true feelings felt like speaking a foreign language. Dante's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the steering wheel. "What did he do to you?" The question was asked quietly, but there was something underneath the calm tone that made Isabella think of barely leashed violence. Not directed at her, but definitely present, definitely dangerous to anyone who might have hurt her. "It's complicated," she said, which was both true and completely inadequate to explain 8 months of systematic emotional abuse and control. "Most things worth understanding are," Dante replied. "We have time." They turned onto Lakeshore Drive, the glittering expanse of Lake Michigan stretching out beside them like a dark mirror reflecting the city lights. Isabella had always loved this view, the way Chicago looked from the lakefront, proud and beautiful and full of possibilities. Tonight, it felt like she was seeing it for the first time, or maybe seeing it again after a long absence. "Where are we going?" she asked, realizing she'd climbed into a car with a virtual stranger without even asking about their destination. "My place. It's safe, and you need somewhere to stay tonight. Unless you'd prefer a hotel." The matter-of-fact way he offered his home should have alarmed her more than it did. Everything about this situation should have terrified her, from his obvious wealth to the barely contained menace he displayed toward Marcus to the way other people in the restaurant had looked at him with a mixture of respect and fear. But sitting beside him in the warm cocoon of his expensive car, Isabella felt safer than she had in months. There was something about his presence that suggested protection rather than threat, at least where she was concerned. He'd asked for her choice, had given her an out, had treated her with more respect in 30 minutes than Marcus had shown her in their entire relationship. "Your place is fine," she said, then added more quietly, "Thank you." He glanced at her briefly, those storm-gray eyes unreadable in the dim light. You don't need to thank me for basic human decency, Isabella. The way he said her name, with that slight accent and genuine warmth, made something flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the attraction she definitely shouldn't be feeling under the circumstances. The penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of a gleaming high-rise overlooking the lake, and stepping into it felt like entering another world entirely. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the Chicago skyline, while the interior was decorated with the kind of understated luxury that whispered rather than shouted about wealth. Rich leather furniture, original artwork, and subtle lighting created an atmosphere that was both sophisticated and surprisingly warm. "This is beautiful," Isabella said, turning slowly to take in the space. "It must be amazing to come home to this every night." Dante shrugged out of his suit jacket and draped it over the back of a chair, the gesture revealing the powerful build she'd only glimpsed at the restaurant. "It's just a place," he said simply. "Home is about more than square footage and expensive furniture." There was something in his tone that suggested loneliness, a kind of emptiness that all the wealth and luxury in the world couldn't fill. Isabella recognized that feeling, had lived with it herself for longer than she cared to admit. "Can I get you something to drink?" Dante asked, moving toward what she assumed was the kitchen. "Wine, coffee, water?" "Water would be great," Isabella replied, still trying to process the surreal turn her life had taken. A few hours ago, her biggest concern had been whether Marcus would be angry about her presentation tomorrow. Now she was standing in a penthouse that probably cost more per month than she made in a year, accepting protection from a man whose last name was starting to trigger uncomfortable recognition in the back of her mind. Romano. Chicago. The combination was definitely familiar, though she couldn't quite place where she'd heard it before. Dante returned with 2 glasses of water and gestured toward the leather sofa that faced the spectacular view. "Please sit. You look like you're about to fall over." Isabella sank into the buttery soft cushions gratefully, realizing that he was right. The adrenaline that had carried her through the restaurant confrontation was beginning to fade, leaving exhaustion in its wake. When was the last time she'd felt truly relaxed? When had she stopped jumping at every unexpected sound, stopped analyzing every conversation for potential landmines? "I should probably explain who I am," Dante said, settling into the chair across from her with the kind of controlled grace that suggested either military training or something equally disciplined. "My family has certain business interests in Chicago. Some of them are completely legitimate, and some of them exist in what you might call gray areas of the law." The careful phrasing sent a chill down Isabella's spine, even as it confirmed her growing suspicions. Romano. Chicago families. Business interests in gray areas. She might have been isolated from friends and current events for the past 8 months, but she wasn't completely naive about the world. "You're talking about organized crime," she said quietly. Dante's expression didn't change, but she caught a slight stiffening in his posture. "Among other things, yes. Does that frighten you?" It should have. Any rational person would have been terrified to learn they'd accepted protection from someone involved in organized crime, would have demanded to be taken home immediately regardless of what waited there. But Isabella found herself studying his face instead of panicking, taking in the strong jaw and intelligent eyes, the way he'd asked the question like her answer actually mattered to him. This man had intervened when Marcus threatened her, had offered her safety without demanding anything in return, had treated her with more genuine respect than anyone had shown her in months. "It should frighten me," she said honestly. "But right now, I'm more afraid of going back to my old life than I am of whatever you represent." Something shifted in Dante's expression, a warmth that softened the harsh angles of his face and made him look younger, more human, less like the dangerous stranger who'd appeared at their table like an avenging angel. "Tell me about him," Dante said quietly. "Your boyfriend. How long has he been hurting you?" The question hit like a physical blow, partly because of its directness and partly because no one had ever asked it before. Not her family, who'd been systematically cut off from her life. Not her friends, who'd been convinced she was too busy with her new relationship to maintain old connections. Not her coworkers, who only saw the smiling professional mask she'd learned to wear. 8 months, Isabella whispered, the words feeling strange on her tongue. "And he doesn't hit me, if that's what you're asking." There are many ways to hurt someone, Dante observed. Physical violence is often the least creative. The understanding in his voice broke something loose in her chest, some carefully constructed dam that had been holding back months of fear and shame and growing despair. Before she could stop herself, words were pouring out. The whole sorry story of how a promising relationship had turned into a prison of criticism and control and carefully orchestrated isolation. She told him about Marcus's initial charm, the way he'd seemed so stable and successful and interested in taking care of her. About the gradual erosion of her confidence through constant criticism disguised as helpful suggestions. About the friends who'd been deemed bad influences and systematically removed from her life. About the family members who'd been painted as jealous troublemakers until she'd stopped reaching out to them entirely. She told him about the walking on eggshells, the constant anxiety, the way she'd learned to predict Marcus's moods and adjust her behavior accordingly. About the slow strangling of her independence and self-worth until she barely recognized the woman she'd become. By the time she finished, tears were streaming down her face, and Dante had moved from the chair to the sofa beside her, his presence solid and reassuring without being overwhelming. "I'm sorry," she whispered, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "I don't know why I'm telling you all of this. You must think I'm pathetic. I think," Dante said carefully, "that you're incredibly strong to have survived what you just described. And I think the man who spent 8 months systematically destroying your sense of self-worth is about to learn that there are consequences for that kind of cruelty." There was something in his voice that made Isabella look up at him sharply. "What do you mean?" Dante's phone buzzed against the glass coffee table, interrupting whatever he'd been about to say. He glanced at the screen, and his expression hardened slightly. "That would be your ex-boyfriend," he said, showing her the unknown number flashing on the display. "He's been calling and texting since we left the restaurant. Would you like me to answer it?" The thought of Marcus's rage, his demands, his threats, made Isabella's stomach clench with familiar anxiety. But sitting here in Dante's penthouse, wrapped in the warmth of genuine safety for the first time in months, she found herself shaking her head. "No," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I don't want to talk to him." Dante's smile was sharp and satisfied. "Good. That's progress." He powered off the phone and set it aside, then looked at Isabella with those penetrating gray-green eyes. "You're going to stay here tonight," he said. "It's not a request. That apartment you shared with him isn't safe anymore, not after what happened tonight." The authoritative tone should have triggered her usual compliance reflex, but instead Isabella found herself nodding gratefully. The thought of returning to Marcus's space, of facing his fury over her public defiance, made her feel sick with dread. "Thank you," she said again, meaning it more than she could express. Dante stood and moved toward the kitchen, his movements fluid and purposeful. "Are you hungry? You barely touched your dinner." Now that he mentioned it, Isabella realized she was starving. The constant anxiety of dinner with Marcus had killed her appetite, but now, in the safety of Dante's penthouse, her body was beginning to remember its basic needs. "I could eat something," she admitted, as Dante moved around his kitchen with surprising competence, preparing what looked like a simple but elegant pasta dish. Isabella found herself watching him with growing fascination. There was something mesmerizing about the controlled grace of his movements, the quiet confidence that suggested he was equally comfortable in a boardroom, a kitchen, or what she was beginning to suspect might be considerably more dangerous environments. "You cook," she observed, settling onto one of the bar stools at the kitchen island. "My mother insisted," Dante replied, not looking up from the stove. "She said any man who couldn't feed himself and the people he cared about was only half a man." The casual reference to people he cared about sent an unexpected warmth through Isabella's chest. When was the last time someone had cared enough about her basic needs to notice she was hungry, let alone take action to remedy it? The pasta was perfect, simple but flavorful, and Isabella found herself eating with more enthusiasm than she'd shown for food in weeks. Across from her, Dante ate more slowly, his attention divided between his meal and watching her with those intense gray eyes. "Better?" he asked when she'd cleaned her plate. "Much better," Isabella admitted. "Thank you. For all of it." As they finished eating, Dante's phone buzzed again from the counter where he'd left it. This time, when he glanced at the screen, his expression shifted to something darker and more dangerous. What is it? Isabella asked, though part of her didn't want to know. Your ex-boyfriend has escalated beyond phone calls, Dante said quietly. He's currently at your workplace, demanding to know where you are and making threats against your co-workers. Isabella's blood ran cold. Marcus knew where she worked, knew her schedule, knew which of her colleagues she was friendly with. The thought of him taking out his rage on innocent people made her feel sick. I should go, she said, starting to rise from her chair. I should talk to him before he does something stupid. Dante's hand came down gently but firmly on her wrist, stopping her movement. You're not going anywhere near that man tonight, he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. I've already made some calls. The situation is being handled. Something in his tone made Isabella's pulse quicken, though she couldn't tell if it was from fear or something else entirely. What kind of calls? The kind that ensure Marcus Hoffman understands he's crossed a line he shouldn't have crossed, Dante replied. Don't worry. No one will be permanently hurt, but he'll receive a very clear message about acceptable behavior going forward. Isabella stared at him, trying to process what he was really saying. Part of her was horrified at the idea of Dante using whatever influence or power he possessed to intimidate Marcus. But another part of her, a part that had been systematically crushed and silenced for months, felt a fierce satisfaction at the thought of Marcus finally facing consequences for his behavior. You don't have to do that, she said weakly. Yes, I do, Dante replied simply. No one threatens women under my protection. It's not negotiable. Under his protection. The phrase sent a complex mix of emotions through Isabella's system, relief and gratitude tangled up with something that felt dangerously like attraction. When was the last time anyone had considered her worthy of protection? When had anyone thought her safety was worth defending? Her phone buzzed then, and Isabella's heart jumped before she realized it was her own device, not Dante's. She pulled it from her purse with trembling fingers and saw Marcus's name on the screen, followed by a series of increasingly aggressive text messages. Where are you? You're making a huge mistake. Come home now, and we can forget this happened. You know you can't make it without me. No one else will put up with your problems like I do. The messages continued, each one more desperate and manipulative than the last, designed to trigger every insecurity and fear Marcus had so carefully cultivated over the past 8 months. Isabella found herself reading them with a strange sense of detachment, as if they were directed at someone else entirely. Sitting in Dante's warm kitchen, her stomach full and her immediate safety assured, Marcus's words seemed to lose some of their power to wound. He's right about one thing, she said quietly, setting the phone aside without responding. I don't know how to make it without him. He's been making all my decisions for months. Then it's time you learned, Dante said simply. And you won't be doing it alone. The promise in his voice made something flutter in Isabella's chest that she definitely shouldn't be feeling about a man she'd known for less than 4 hours. But there was something about Dante Romano that made her feel more like herself than she had in months. Something that made her remember the woman she'd been before Marcus had systematically convinced her she was worthless. Later, as Dante showed her to the guest bedroom with its own private bathroom and view of the lake, Isabella caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. Her eyes were brighter than they'd been in months, her posture straighter, her expression less guarded. For the first time since meeting Marcus Hoffman, Isabella Chun went to sleep without being afraid of what tomorrow might bring. Isabella woke to sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows and the unfamiliar sensation of having slept through the entire night without waking in a cold sweat. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't remember where she was, the luxury of the guest bedroom so far removed from her normal reality that it felt like waking up in someone else's life. Then the events of the previous evening came flooding back. The restaurant, Marcus's threats, Dante Romano's unexpected intervention, the drive to his penthouse, the revelation about his family's business interests, the way he'd listened to her story without judgment or pity, the way he'd made her feel safe for the first time in 8 months. Isabella sat up slowly, her body more relaxed than it had been in longer than she could remember. No tension headache from sleeping with clenched muscles. No knot of anxiety in her stomach from anticipating Marcus's morning mood. No careful calculation of what she might say or do wrong before she even got out of bed. Instead, there was sunlight and the distant sound of classical music playing somewhere in the penthouse, and the rich aroma of coffee drifting under her bedroom door. She padded to the window in the oversized t-shirt Dante had provided the night before, taking in the spectacular view of Lake Michigan stretching endlessly toward the horizon. From this height, the lake looked peaceful and infinite, a vast expanse of possibility that made her chest feel lighter than it had in months. A soft knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. "Isabella?" Dante's voice was quiet, respectful, nothing like Marcus's demanding morning pronouncements. "I've made coffee and breakfast, if you're interested. No pressure if you'd prefer to rest." The consideration in his voice, the way he gave her choice even in something as simple as breakfast, made something warm unfurl in her chest. "Coming," she called back, then caught sight of herself in the mirror and winced. Her dark hair was a disaster, her makeup from the night before smudged beyond repair, and the borrowed t-shirt hung on her small frame like a tent. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman who'd fled her life with nothing but the clothes on her back and the desperate hope that anywhere was better than where she'd been. But when she emerged from the bedroom, Dante's expression held only warmth and what might have been relief. He'd changed from his expensive suit into dark jeans and a charcoal gray sweater that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and made his eyes look more green than gray in the morning light. "Good morning," he said, his accent more pronounced in the relaxed atmosphere of his own home. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I have in months," Isabella admitted, then felt heat rise in her cheeks at how revealing that statement was. But Dante only nodded as if her answer didn't surprise him at all. "Trauma affects sleep patterns," he said simply. "Feeling safe is the first step toward healing." The casual way he acknowledged her trauma, without making her feel broken or damaged, sent a wave of gratitude through her that was almost overwhelming. When was the last time someone had spoken to her like she was worth healing? Like she deserved to feel safe? The kitchen smelled like heaven, rich coffee, and something that made her stomach growl with sudden hunger. Dante had prepared what looked like eggs Benedict with fresh fruit and perfectly toasted bread, the kind of breakfast she'd only ever seen in expensive hotels or food magazines. "You didn't have to go to this much trouble," Isabella said, settling onto one of the bar stools at the kitchen island. "It's not trouble," Dante replied, sliding a perfectly plated breakfast in front of her along with a steaming mug of coffee. "I enjoy cooking, and you need to eat properly. When was the last time you had a real breakfast?" Isabella considered the question and realized she couldn't remember. Marcus had preferred they eat separately in the mornings, claiming her presence distracted him from preparing for important work meetings. She'd gotten used to grabbing a piece of toast or a protein bar on her way out the door, eating alone while he showered or made phone calls. "It's been a while," she said quietly. Dante's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and she caught a flash of something dangerous in his eyes before he controlled his expression. "Another mark against Marcus Hoffman. Then," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "we'll add it to the list." The casual way he spoke about keeping score of Marcus's failings should have alarmed her, but instead Isabella found herself fighting back a smile. There was something deeply satisfying about having someone notice the small cruelties she'd endured, someone who thought they mattered enough to remember. The eggs Benedict was perfect, rich and creamy and more delicious than anything she'd tasted in months. As she ate, Dante moved around the kitchen with the same controlled grace she'd noticed the night before, cleaning up from his cooking with an efficiency that spoke of long practice. "You really do cook often," Isabella observed, watching him work. "My mother made sure I could take care of myself," Dante said, a slight smile softening his features. "She used to say that a man who expected to be served hand and foot was a man who would never truly understand the value of what he'd been given." There was affection in his voice when he spoke of his mother, but also something that sounded like old grief. Isabella found herself curious about this woman who'd raised a son to be dangerous and powerful, but also considerate enough to cook breakfast for a traumatized stranger. "Is she?" Isabella began, then stopped, uncertain how to ask if his mother was still alive without potentially opening old wounds. "She died when I was 22, Dante said quietly, understanding her unfinished question. "Car accident. My father followed her 6 months later. Heart attack, officially, but I think he just couldn't live without her." "I'm sorry," Isabella said, meaning it. "That must have been devastating." Dante paused in his cleaning, his hands stilling on the dish towel he'd been using. "It was," he said simply. "Losing them both so close together, suddenly becoming responsible for family business I'd never expected to inherit so young. There were days I wasn't sure I'd survive it. The vulnerability in his admission made Isabella's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. This powerful, dangerous man who'd swept into her life like an avenging angel had his own wounds, his own losses that had shaped him into who he was. "How did you get through it?" she asked softly. "Family, mostly. My sister Sophia, my cousins, the men who'd served my father faithfully and were willing to teach his unprepared son how to fill shoes he'd never expected to wear. And work, probably too much work. Staying busy enough that the grief couldn't catch up with me." Isabella nodded, understanding that impulse to outrun pain through constant motion. She'd done something similar in the early days with Marcus, throwing herself into their relationship and her work and the careful construction of a new identity as his girlfriend, anything to avoid confronting the growing unease about the person she was becoming. "What about you?" Dante asked, settling into the chair across from her with his own coffee. "You mentioned a sister last night. Are you close?" The question hit unexpectedly sensitive territory, and Isabella felt her throat tighten. Lily. God, when was the last time she'd spoken to her baby sister? 3 months? 4? "We were," Isabella said carefully. "Lily's 7 years younger than me, still in college. We used to talk almost every day, but Marcus thought she was a bad influence on me. He said she was jealous of our relationship and trying to sabotage it by filling my head with doubts." The words sounded ridiculous spoken aloud, especially in the warm safety of Dante's kitchen. How had she let herself believe that Lily, sweet protective Lily who'd always been Isabella's biggest cheerleader, was somehow the problem? "Isolation is a classic control tactic," Dante said quietly. "Make you dependent on him for all social connection. Eliminate anyone who might offer a different perspective on the relationship." The clinical way he described Marcus's manipulation should have been comforting, but instead it made Isabella feel foolish and naive. How had she not seen it happening? How had she let herself become so completely cut off from everyone who'd ever cared about her? "Hey," Dante said gently, and she realized she must have looked distressed. "None of this is your fault. Abusers are skilled at making their victims believe they're choosing the isolation, that they're the ones making the decision to push people away." "I miss her so much," Isabella whispered, tears threatening. "She probably thinks I hate her, that I chose him over her. What if she won't forgive me?" Dante reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the contact warm and reassuring without being overwhelming. "Then you call her," he said simply. "Today. Explain what happened. Apologize if you need to, but don't let his manipulation cost you a relationship that matters to you." The idea of reaching out to Lily, of admitting how badly she'd screwed up, filled Isabella with anxiety. But sitting there with Dante's strong hand covering hers, she found herself nodding. The sound of the elevator arriving interrupted their conversation, and Dante's expression shifted subtly, becoming more alert. "That'll be Sophia," he said, releasing Isabella's hand and rising from his chair. "I asked her to come by this morning." "You called your sister?" Isabella asked, suddenly self-conscious about her appearance and what Dante might have told his family about the strange woman who'd spent the night. "I wanted her to meet you," Dante said, his tone suggesting this was completely normal rather than presumptuous. "Sophia's good with people who've been hurt. She'll like you." Before Isabella could ask what he meant by that, a woman's voice called out from the main living area. "Dante, where's this mysterious woman you rescued from a restaurant?" "I brought pastries and an overwhelming desire to gossip." The voice was warm and slightly accented, carrying laughter and genuine affection. Despite her nervousness, Isabella found herself smiling at the obvious bond between the siblings. "In the kitchen, Sophia," Dante called back. "And try to contain your overwhelming desire to terrorize my guest before she's finished her coffee." Sophia Romano appeared in the kitchen doorway like a whirlwind of elegant energy, and Isabella immediately understood where Dante had inherited his striking looks. She was probably in her late 20s, with the same dark hair and gray-green eyes, though her features were more delicate and her expression considerably warmer than her brother's usual intensity. "You must be Isabella," Sophia said, her smile bright and welcoming as she set down a bakery box that smelled like heaven. "I'm Sophia, Dante's sister and primary source of unsolicited advice. I hope he's been behaving himself." The easy friendliness in Sophia's voice dissolved some of Isabella's anxiety. There was nothing calculating or judgmental in her expression, just genuine warmth and what looked like protective concern. "He's been wonderful," Isabella said honestly. "More kind than I had any right to expect from a stranger." Sophia's eyebrows rose slightly, and she glanced meaningfully at her brother. "Stranger? Dante, you didn't tell her?" "Tell me what?" Isabella asked, looking between the siblings with growing confusion. "That rescuing beautiful women in distress is basically his superpower," Sophia said with a grin. "He can't help himself. It's compulsive at this point." "Sophia," Dante warned, but there was affection in his tone rather than real irritation. "What?" "It's true. Remember Maria from the nightclub? Anna from the subway? That prosecutor who was being stalked by her ex? You have a type, brother dear, and that type needs protection from dangerous men." Heat rose in Isabella's cheeks as the implications of Sophia's teasing sank in. Was she just another charity case to Dante? Another damaged woman he'd felt obligated to help? But when she looked at him, his expression was serious rather than embarrassed. "It's not like that," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on Isabella's face. "Not with you." The intensity in his voice made something flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with attraction she definitely shouldn't be feeling. This was too fast, too complicated, too dangerous in every possible way. But God help her, when Dante Romano looked at her like she mattered to him personally rather than as an abstract victim to be protected, Isabella felt more alive than she had in months. Sophia's knowing smile suggested she'd caught the undercurrent of tension between them, but she wisely chose not to comment directly. Instead, she began unpacking pastries and chattering about her work as an art therapist, drawing Isabella into conversation with the kind of skillful ease that suggested extensive experience putting traumatized people at their ease. As the morning progressed, Isabella found herself relaxing in ways she'd forgotten were possible. Sophia was funny and warm and refreshingly direct, treating Isabella like a friend rather than a victim or a burden. When she learned about Isabella's background in graphic design, her excitement was genuine and infectious. "You have to see Dante's study," Sophia said, grabbing Isabella's hand with the casual affection that seemed to run in the Romano family. "He's got this gorgeous space with the most amazing natural light, but the walls are practically bare because he has no artistic vision whatsoever. You could totally help him make it less depressing and corporate." "I could sketch some ideas," Isabella offered tentatively, the creative part of her brain already stirring with possibilities. "If that would be helpful." Dante's smile was warm and encouraging. "I'd like that very much." The study was spectacular, all dark wood and leather furniture with windows that offered an even better view than the main living area. But Sophia was right about the walls, which were mostly empty except for a few generic pieces that looked like they'd come with the penthouse. Isabella found herself walking slowly around the space, her designer's eye automatically cataloging the natural light, the architectural details, the way the furniture was arranged. Her fingers itched for a sketchpad, for the familiar comfort of translating visual ideas into concrete plans. Without really thinking about it, she pulled a small notebook from her purse and began sketching rough layout ideas, her hand moving with a confidence and purpose she hadn't felt in months. "This would look better here," she murmured, mostly to herself. "And maybe something with warmer colors over there to balance the heaviness of the wood." When she looked up, both Romano siblings were watching her with expressions of quiet satisfaction, as if they'd witnessed something they'd been hoping to see. "What?" Isabella asked, suddenly self-conscious. "You look like yourself," Dante said simply. "Not like someone trying to disappear or apologize for existing. Like the woman you're supposed to be." The observation hit with unexpected force, and Isabella felt tears threaten again. When had she stopped feeling like herself? When had she started measuring every action, every word, every creative impulse against Marcus's potential disapproval? She was safe from having to respond by the sound of Dante's phone ringing from the kitchen. His expression shifted immediately, becoming more alert and focused as he glanced at the caller ID. "I need to take this," he said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone Isabella had heard hints of the night before. "Sophia, would you mind staying with Isabella?" "Of course," Sophia replied, but her expression had grown more serious as well. suggesting she recognized something in her brother's demeanor that indicated business rather than a casual call. Dante stepped into the hallway for privacy, but Isabella could hear the low murmur of his voice, the tone becoming increasingly sharp and dangerous. Sophia moved closer to her, a protective gesture that was subtle but unmistakable. "What's wrong?" Isabella asked quietly. "I'm not sure yet," Sophia admitted. But when Dante uses that tone, it usually means someone has made a very poor decision that's about to have consequences. When Dante returned a few minutes later, his expression was thunderous. "The Marcus Hoffman situation has escalated," he announced without preamble. "He's attempting to locate your family members to use as leverage against you." Isabella's blood ran cold. "My family. But I haven't spoken to them in months. How would Marcus even know how to find them?" "Social media, probably," Dante said grimly. "Your sister Lily posted something on Instagram yesterday about starting her senior year at Northwestern. He's been calling the university, claiming to be your fiancé with a family emergency that requires reaching your sister immediately." The room seemed to tilt around Isabella as the implications sank in. Marcus was going after Lily now. Innocent Lily, who had nothing to do with any of this except having the misfortune to be related to Isabella. "I have to call her," Isabella said, reaching for her phone with shaking hands. "I have to warn her." "Already handled," Dante said calmly. "Lily is currently under discreet protection, and she's been informed that her sister is safe, but that she should be cautious about any contact from your ex-boyfriend. She's been given a secure number to reach you." "You?" Isabella stared at him. "You had my sister contacted by strangers? Without asking me?" "To keep her safe," Dante replied, his tone unapologetic. "Marcus Hoffman has escalated to threatening family members. That makes him dangerous to more people than just you." The protective authority in his voice should have annoyed her, should have triggered memories of Marcus's controlling behavior. But this felt different. Where Marcus's control had been about possession and dominance, Dante's actions felt like genuine protection, like someone who cared more about her safety than about maintaining power over her choices. "Is she okay?" Isabella asked quietly. "Lily, is she scared?" "According to my people, she's more angry than scared," Sophia said with a slight smile. "Apparently, she's been worried about you for months and is relieved to know you're somewhere safe. She wants to talk to you as soon as possible." The relief was so intense, it was almost painful. Lily wasn't hurt, wasn't in immediate danger, and apparently didn't hate her for the months of radio silence. Isabella felt tears beginning again, but this time they were tears of gratitude rather than fear. "Thank you," she whispered to Dante, "for protecting her when I couldn't." Something shifted in his expression then, becoming warmer and more personal. "Always," he said simply, and the promise in his voice made her heart race. The moment stretched between them, charged with growing awareness and attraction that Isabella was finding increasingly difficult to ignore. When Dante looked at her like that, like she was precious and worth protecting and possibly worth loving, she felt like the woman she'd been before Marcus had systematically convinced her she was worthless. Sophia cleared her throat delicately, reminding them they weren't alone. "I should probably go," she said with a knowing smile. "But Isabella, I hope you'll let me take you shopping later this week. You're going to need some things if you're staying here," and Dante's fashion sense extends only to expensive suits and workout clothes. The assumption that she'd be staying sent a flutter of panic through Isabella's system, mixed with something that might have been hope. Was she staying? What did that even mean? And why did the thought of leaving Dante's protection feel so much worse than staying in this dangerous new world? After Sophia left, the penthouse felt smaller somehow, more intimate with just the two of them. Isabella found herself hyper-aware of Dante's presence as they settled back into the living room. The way he moved with that controlled grace, the way his attention seemed to focus on her so completely when she spoke. She was sketching again, this time working on more detailed designs for his study, when she realized he'd moved from his chair to the sofa beside her, not crowding her, but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, close enough to smell his cologne and something underneath that was purely him. When she looked up from her notebook, she found him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. There was admiration in his expression, but also something hungrier, something that made her pulse quicken and her skin feel sensitized. "Isabella," he said quietly, and her name sounded different in his voice, warmer and more intimate than it had any right to be. "Yes," she whispered, though she wasn't sure what she was agreeing to. He moved slowly, giving her time to pull away, time to object, time to remember all the reasons this was a terrible idea. But when his hand came up to cup her cheek, when his thumb traced gently across her skin, Isabella found herself leaning into the touch instead of retreating. "You're so beautiful," he murmured, his accent thicker now, his voice rough with something that sounded like barely controlled want. The compliment should have triggered memories of Marcus's calculated praise, the way he'd used flattery to manipulate and control. But this felt different, genuine, like Dante was seeing something in her that she'd almost forgotten existed. When he leaned closer, when his intentions became unmistakably clear, Isabella's heart hammered against her ribs with anticipation rather than fear. She wanted this, wanted him to kiss her, wanted to feel desired and cherished rather than criticized and diminished. Their lips were almost touching when his phone rang, shattering the moment with jarring efficiency. Dante cursed under his breath in what sounded like Italian, but he pulled away immediately, reaching for his phone with obvious reluctance. "Romano," he answered curtly, and Isabella could hear the controlled frustration in his voice. As he listened to whoever was on the other end, his expression grew progressively darker. "Yes, I understand," he said finally. "Double the security detail and make sure the message is very clear." "No, I'll handle it personally." He ended the call and looked at Isabella with something that might have been regret. "I have to go," he said quietly. "Business that can't wait." Isabella nodded, trying to ignore the disappointment coursing through her system. Of course he had to go. Men like Dante Romano didn't put their entire lives on hold for women they'd known less than 24 hours, no matter how attracted they might be. But as he stood to leave, Dante paused beside the sofa, his hand coming down to brush gently through her hair. "When I come back tonight," he said, his voice low and rough with promise, "we're going to finish what we started." The words sent heat spiraling through her body, and Isabella found herself nodding before she could think better of it. When he looked at her like that, when he spoke to her like she was someone worth waiting for, worth coming home to, she felt brave enough to want things she hadn't dared to want in months. After he left, Isabella sat in the quiet luxury of his penthouse, her sketchbook forgotten in her lap, her fingers touching her lips where his kiss would have landed. For the first time since meeting Marcus Hoffman, she found herself looking forward to the evening ahead instead of dreading it. Maybe, just maybe, she was falling in love with her dangerous protector. And maybe, for the first time in 8 months, that didn't terrify her as much as it should. Isabella stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror of Dante's penthouse, trying to summon the courage for what she was about to do. She'd borrowed one of Sophia's blouses and a pair of dress pants that were slightly too long, but would work for a day at the office. Her makeup covered most of the evidence of yesterday's emotional upheaval, and her hair was pulled back in the kind of professional style that had become second nature over her years in graphic design. She looked normal, competent, like someone who belonged in an office rather than hiding in a penthouse under the protection of a man whose last name was becoming more familiar and more concerning the more she thought about it. But that was exactly why she had to do this. She couldn't lose herself again, couldn't let another man make all her decisions for her, even if his motives were protective rather than controlling. The past 24 hours had been a revelation in safety and care, but they'd also been a suspension of her real life. She had clients depending on her, projects with deadlines, a career she'd worked too hard to build to let it crumble because of Marcus's threats. Dante wasn't going to like her decision. She'd seen the way his jaw had tightened when she'd mentioned wanting to return to work during breakfast, had watched his eyes grow stormy when she'd insisted she couldn't hide indefinitely. But this wasn't his choice to make, and she needed to prove to herself that she was still capable of making her own decisions, even difficult ones. When she emerged from the bedroom with her purse and laptop bag, she found Dante waiting in the living room, his expression carefully neutral in a way that suggested he was working hard to control his initial reaction. "You're sure about this?" he said, not quite making it a question. "I'm sure," Isabella replied, trying to project more confidence than she felt. "I can't let Marcus destroy everything I've worked for, and I can't spend the rest of my life hiding from him." Dante studied her face for a long moment, and she could practically see him weighing arguments, considering ways to convince her to stay where he could protect her more easily. But finally, he nodded once, a gesture that held more respect than she'd expected. Then you won't go alone, he said simply. Marco will drive you and remain outside your building. Anything feels wrong, anything at all, you call me immediately. The compromise was reasonable, more than reasonable given what they both knew about Marcus's escalating behavior. Isabella found herself nodding gratefully, relieved that Dante was willing to support her choice rather than override it. The ride to her office building in downtown Chicago was tense, but uneventful. Marco turned out to be a quietly competent man in his late 20s who treated Isabella with polite deference and kept his questions to himself. Still, sitting in the back of another expensive car with another member of Dante's organization, Isabella couldn't escape the growing awareness of exactly what world she'd fallen into. Romano. Chicago crime families. Men who handled problems with the kind of efficiency that didn't involve calling the police. She should have been terrified, should have been planning her escape from a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond anything she could control. Instead, she found herself thinking about the way Dante had looked at her that morning, the careful respect he'd shown for her decision despite his obvious concern. The way he'd listened to her fears about losing her independence without making her feel foolish or paranoid. When was the last time a man had supported her choices rather than trying to manage them? Her graphic design firm occupied the 15th floor of a gleaming office tower, and walking through the familiar lobby felt like returning to herself after a long absence. This was her world, the career she'd built through talent and hard work, the place where she was valued for her creativity and skill rather than judged for her perceived inadequacies. The morning passed in a blur of client calls and project reviews. Isabella threw herself into her work with the kind of focused intensity she hadn't felt in months, rediscovering the satisfaction of solving creative problems and bringing visual concepts to life. Her colleagues seemed genuinely pleased to see her, several commenting that she looked more relaxed than she had in weeks. If only they knew, Isabella thought wryly, that looking relaxed was apparently the result of spending the night under the protection of a man who could have Marcus disappeared with a phone call. She was deep in concentration on a logo redesign when her assistant's voice came through the intercom, sounding strained and uncomfortable. Isabella, there's someone here to see you. He says he's your fiancé, and it's urgent. Isabella's blood turned to ice in her veins. Fiancé. Marcus was here, in her workplace, using that ridiculous lie he'd started telling people recently despite the fact that he'd never actually proposed. She'd corrected him the first few times, but he'd gotten so angry about her public rejection of his narrative that she'd eventually stopped fighting it. Now that compliance was coming back to haunt her. Tell him I'm not available, Isabella said quietly into the intercom, her hands beginning to shake as adrenaline flooded her system. Actually, don't tell him anything. Call building security. But even as she spoke, she could hear Marcus's voice growing louder in the reception area, could hear him demanding to see her with the kind of aggressive entitlement that had become all too familiar. Her assistant's protests were getting more flustered, and Isabella realized that Marcus wasn't going to be deterred by polite refusals. Her hands trembling, she pulled out her phone and found Dante's number. He answered on the first ring, as if he'd been waiting for her call. Isabella? What's wrong? He's here, she whispered, not daring to speak louder in case Marcus could hear her. At my office. He's calling himself my fiancé and demanding to see me. The silence on the other end of the line was somehow more frightening than shouting would have been. When Dante spoke again, his voice was deadly calm. Stay exactly where you are. Lock your office door if you can. I'm on my way. But even as Isabella moved toward her office door, she could hear Marcus's voice getting closer, could hear him arguing with building security about his right to see his fiancée during a family emergency. The lies rolled off his tongue with practiced ease, each one designed to make anyone who opposed him look unreasonable and cruel. Isabella's office door opened before she could reach it, and Marcus stepped inside with the kind of aggressive confidence that made the room feel suddenly smaller and more dangerous. He'd always been an imposing man, tall and broad-shouldered with the kind of presence that served him well in courtroom intimidation. But now, with his face flushed with anger and his eyes bright with something that looked like barely controlled rage, he seemed genuinely threatening. There you are, he said, closing the door behind him with deliberate force. Do you have any idea how worried I've been? Disappearing like that, not answering your phone, making me look like a fool in front of everyone. The familiar pattern of turning his behavior into her fault made Isabella's stomach clench with automatic anxiety. But underneath the fear, she felt something else stirring. Anger. She was tired of being blamed for Marcus's reactions, tired of managing his emotions at the expense of her own safety and sanity. "I left because you threatened me," she said quietly, keeping her voice low to avoid alerting her coworkers to the drama unfolding in her office. In public, in front of witnesses. "You said I was done when we got home." Marcus's expression shifted, becoming the practiced look of hurt confusion he'd perfected over the course of their relationship. "Bella, you're overreacting." "I was frustrated, yes, but you know I'd never actually hurt you. We're having some communication issues, but that's what couples counseling is for." The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced, that for a moment Isabella almost found herself questioning her own memory of the previous evening. Had she overreacted? Had she misunderstood his intentions? But then she remembered Dante's calm strength, the way he'd listened to her story without trying to minimize or reframe her experiences, the way he'd made her feel heard and believed and worthy of protection. The contrast between Marcus's manipulation and Dante's genuine care was stark enough to cut through months of conditioning. "I'm not overreacting," Isabella said firmly, "and I'm not coming home with you." Marcus's mask slipped thin, revealing the cold anger underneath. "You're making a huge mistake, Isabella. Whatever fantasy you're living with that criminal you left with, it's not real. Men like Dante Romano don't keep women like you around once they get what they want." The words hit like physical blows, each one designed to target her deepest insecurities and fears. Marcus had always been skilled at finding the exact combination of words that would make her doubt herself, make her feel grateful for his attention rather than resentful of his control. But this time, something had shifted. Instead of internalize his cruelty, Isabella felt her anger crystallizing into something harder and more determined. "You don't get to decide what's real for me anymore," she said, her voice growing stronger. "You don't get to tell me what I deserve or who I can trust. I'm done with your manipulation, Marcus. I'm done with feeling like I have to apologize for existing." Marcus's face went red with genuine rage, the carefully controlled facade finally cracking completely. "You ungrateful bitch," he snarled, taking a step closer that made Isabella instinctively back toward her desk. "I gave you everything. Stability, security, a future most women would kill for. And this is how you repay me? By whoring yourself out to some gangster who'll dispose of you the minute he gets bored." The venom in his voice, the ugly words designed to strip away every bit of confidence she'd managed to rebuild, made Isabella's vision blur with tears of fury and hurt. This was who Marcus really was underneath all the charm and success and promises of protection. This was what she'd been living with, what she'd been slowly dying under. She was reaching for her phone to call for help when the office door opened again, and Dante Romano stepped inside with the kind of lethal calm that made the air in the room feel suddenly charged with electricity. He wasn't alone. Two other men flanked him, both wearing expensive suits and expressions that suggested they were very good at handling problems that required a more physical solution. But it was Dante himself who commanded attention, whose presence seemed to fill the space and make Marcus's aggressive posturing look suddenly small and pathetic. "Mr. Hoffman," Dante said politely, his accent more pronounced than usual. "How unfortunate to find you here, harassing Isabella at her place of work." Marcus spun around, his face cycling through surprise, fear, and desperate bravado. "This is a private conversation between me and my fiancée," he said, trying to reclaim some authority. "You have no right to be here." Dante's smile was cold and sharp as a blade. "Fiancé? That's interesting, considering Isabella has made it quite clear that your relationship is over. And as for my rights, I think you'll find that my presence anywhere in this city is rarely questioned." The casual way he spoke about his influence, the quiet confidence that suggested he could do whatever he wanted without consequence, made Marcus take an involuntary step backward. Isabella could see him finally beginning to understand exactly who he was dealing with, exactly how outmatched he was in this confrontation. "You can't intimidate me," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction now, the bluster of a man who was beginning to realize he'd made a catastrophic miscalculation. "I have friends too. Important people who won't appreciate this kind of behavior." Dante tilted his head slightly, as if considering this threat with genuine interest. Important people, he repeated thoughtfully. Would those be the same important people who've been distancing themselves from you since word got around about your behavior toward Isabella? Because I have to tell you, Mr. Hoffman, your reputation is not what it once was. The words hit Marcus like physical blows, and Isabella could see the moment when his remaining confidence crumbled. Dante had done more than simply protect her, she realized. He'd been systematically dismantling Marcus's professional and social standing, using the kind of influence that came with power and connections most people could only imagine. The realization should have alarmed her, but instead Isabella felt a fierce satisfaction at seeing Marcus finally face consequences for his behavior. How many other women had suffered under his control because no one had been willing or able to hold him accountable. You need to leave, Dante said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made it clear this wasn't a request. You need to leave this building, stop contacting Isabella in any way, and consider very carefully whether continuing this pattern of behavior is worth the consequences it will bring. Marcus looked between Dante and Isabella, his expression cycling between rage and something that might have been genuine fear. This isn't over, he said finally, the threat falling flat in the face of Dante's overwhelming presence. Yes, Dante replied with chilling certainty. It is. After Marcus left, escorted by Dante's men with the kind of professional efficiency that suggested they'd handled similar situations before, Isabella found herself alone in her office with the man who'd become her protector, her salvation, and increasingly, the focus of feelings she definitely shouldn't be having. She was shaking, she realized, the adrenaline and fear and fury of the confrontation hitting her all at once. Her legs felt unsteady, her hands trembled as she tried to gather her scattered papers, and tears of reaction were threatening to spill over. Hey, Dante said softly, moving toward her with careful, non-threatening movements. You're safe. He's gone and he won't be back. I know, Isabella whispered, but the words came out broken and shaky. God, Dante, the things he said, the way he looked at me, like I was nothing, like I was something he owned that was malfunctioning. Dante's expression darkened with barely controlled fury, but when he reached for her, his touch was infinitely gentle. You are not nothing, he said firmly, his hands framing her face with reverent care. You are brave and strong and beautiful, and you deserve to be treated like the precious thing you are. The words, spoken with such conviction and tenderness, broke something loose in Isabella's chest. All the fear and pain and confusion of the past 24 hours came pouring out in a flood of tears that she couldn't control, months of suppressed emotion finally finding release in the safety of Dante's presence. He held her while she cried, his strong arms wrapped around her with protective warmth, his voice murmuring soft reassurances in Italian that she didn't understand but found infinitely comforting. When was the last time someone had held her while she cried? When had anyone offered comfort without expecting something in return? I'm sorry, she whispered against his chest when the tears finally began to subside. I'm such a mess. No, Dante said firmly, his hands stroking gently through her hair. You're human. You're allowed to feel everything you're feeling. You're allowed to be angry and scared and hurt by what you've been through. The permission to feel, to be imperfect and wounded and still worthy of care, sent fresh tears streaming down her face. Marcus had spent months convincing her that her emotions were inconvenient and excessive, that her reactions to his behavior were overblown and dramatic. But Dante held her like her pain mattered, like she mattered. When she finally lifted her head to look at him, Isabella found herself caught by the intensity in his storm-gray eyes. There was tenderness there, yes, but also something hungrier, something that made her pulse quicken and her skin feel suddenly sensitized. Isabella, he said quietly, and her name sounded like a prayer in his voice. This time, when he moved to kiss her, there was no phone call to interrupt, no external threat to pull his attention away. This time, when his lips met hers with gentle reverence, Isabella kissed him back with all the gratitude and growing love and desperate need for connection that had been building between them. The kiss was everything she'd forgotten a kiss could be. Tender but passionate, respectful but full of barely controlled desire. Dante kissed her like she was precious, like she was chosen, like she was exactly what he'd been waiting for his entire life. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Isabella found herself staring up at him with wonder and want and something that felt dangerously like love. "Take me home," she whispered, and the words carried more meaning than just a request for transportation. Dante's eyes darkened with understanding and desire. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly. "Because once we cross this line, Isabella, I'm not going to want to let you go." The warning should have frightened her, should have triggered memories of Marcus's possessive control. But this felt different, felt like a choice rather than a trap, felt like being claimed rather than being owned. "I'm sure," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The ride back to the penthouse was charged with anticipation and unspoken promises. Isabella found herself hyper-aware of everything. The warmth of Dante's hand covering hers, the way he kept glancing at her with barely contained want, the way her own body was responding to the promise of what was about to happen between them. When they reached his penthouse, Dante turned to face her fully, his expression serious despite the desire she could see burning in his eyes. "I need you to know," he said quietly, "that this isn't about gratitude or circumstances or some misguided sense of obligation. This is about you, Isabella. About the way I feel when I look at you, the way you make me want things I thought I'd given up on." The honesty in his voice, the vulnerability he was showing her, made her heart race with something much deeper than simple attraction. "What kinds of things?" she asked softly. "Partnership," Dante said simply. "Someone to come home to who sees me as more than just my last name or my business interests. Someone who makes me want to be better than I am." The words hit her with stunning force, and Isabella realized that somewhere between yesterday's restaurant intervention and this moment, she'd fallen completely, irrevocably in love with this dangerous, protective, surprisingly tender man. "I see you," she whispered, reaching up to cup his face with trembling hands. "Not your reputation or your power or your money. Just you, Dante. And what I see is worth loving." The effect of her words on him was immediate and overwhelming. His control, so carefully maintained, finally cracked completely, and he kissed her with the kind of desperate passion that spoke of months or years of loneliness finally finding its answer. When he lifted her in his arms and carried her toward his bedroom, Isabella felt no fear, no doubt, no lingering shadows from Marcus's abuse. There was only Dante, only the promise of being cherished and protected and loved in ways she'd never dared to hope for. Their lovemaking was a revelation of tenderness and patience and overwhelming emotion. Dante touched her like she was made of precious things, kissed her like she was air and he'd been drowning, loved her with the kind of reverent passion that healed wounds she hadn't even known she was carrying. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the aftermath of overwhelming intimacy, Isabella felt more herself than she had in years. Dante's arms around her felt like safety and home and future all wrapped together, and when he whispered that he loved her against her hair, she knew without question that she loved him back. Outside the penthouse windows, Chicago glittered in the afternoon sun, and somewhere in the city, Marcus was learning that his reign of terror was finally over. But inside the warm cocoon of Dante's bedroom, Isabella Chun was discovering what it felt like to be truly, completely, infinitely cherished. For the first time in 8 months, she wasn't afraid of what tomorrow might bring. She was looking forward to it. Isabella woke to the sound of urgent voices in the hallway outside Dante's bedroom, low and tense in a way that immediately set her nerves on edge. Beside her, Dante was already reaching for his phone, his body shifting into the kind of alert readiness she was beginning to recognize as his response to potential threats. The afternoon light streaming through the windows told her they'd slept for several hours after their lovemaking, wrapped together in the kind of exhausted contentment that came from finally surrendering to feelings too powerful to fight. But now reality was intruding in the form of whatever crisis had brought armed men to Dante's penthouse in the middle of the day. "What's wrong?" Isabella asked quietly, pulling the sheet around herself as Dante rose from the bed and began pulling on clothes with efficient, economical movements. "I'm not sure yet," Dante replied, his voice carrying the controlled tension she'd heard when he dealt with family business. But Marco wouldn't interrupt unless it was serious. A sharp knock on the bedroom door confirmed his assessment. "Boss," Marco's voice carried urgent respect. We need you out here. It's about the Hoffman situation. Isabella's blood chilled at the mention of Marcus, and she found herself reaching automatically for her own clothes. Driven by an instinct that told her whatever was happening, she needed to be prepared for it. Dante paused in buttoning his shirt to look at her, his expression torn between protection and practicality. "Stay here," he said gently. "Let me handle whatever this is first." But Isabella was already shaking her head, pulling on the borrowed clothes she'd worn to work that morning. "No," she said firmly. "If this is about Marcus, if it affects my safety, I need to know. I'm tired of other people making decisions about my life without including me." Something shifted in Dante's expression, respect, and what might have been pride replacing his initial protective instinct. After a moment, he nodded once. "Then stay close to me," he said simply. "And if I tell you to do something, don't argue." The main living area of the penthouse had been transformed into something resembling a war room. Marco stood near the windows with two other men Isabella didn't recognize, all of them wearing expressions of grim focus. Sophia was there too, her usual warmth replaced by the kind of sharp intelligence that reminded Isabella that being a Romano meant understanding danger as well as luxury. When Dante emerged from the bedroom with Isabella beside him, all conversation stopped. Marco stepped forward with the kind of deference that spoke of years of loyalty and trust. "Hoffman made a move 3 hours ago," Marco reported without preamble. "Hired contractors to grab Isabella from her office building. Professional outfit, not local talent. They were waiting in the parking garage when she should have been leaving work." Isabella felt the blood drain from her face as the implications hit her. If she'd followed her normal routine, if Dante hadn't come to get her personally after Marcus's confrontation, she would have walked directly into a kidnapping attempt. "How professional?" Dante asked, his voice carrying deadly calm. "Ex-military, probably. Good equipment, solid planning, escape routes mapped. This wasn't desperation, boss. This was calculated and well-funded." The clinical way Marco discussed her near-kidnapping made Isabella's knees feel unsteady, but it was Dante's reaction that truly frightened her. She could see him processing the information, calculating implications and responses with the kind of strategic thinking that came from years of handling threats most people couldn't imagine. "Where is he now?" Dante asked. "Unknown. Went dark after the team reported the failed grab. But boss, there's more. The contractors weren't local, but the money came through Vegas connections. Hoffman's been calling in favors, making promises he probably can't keep." Sophia moved closer to Isabella then, her presence offering comfort and solidarity in a room suddenly full of masculine tension and barely contained violence. "These aren't just empty threats anymore," she said quietly. "Marcus has escalated to hiring actual criminals. This is war now, not harassment." The word hung in the air like a physical presence, and Isabella found herself struggling to process the reality of her situation. Somehow, her toxic relationship with an abusive lawyer had become a conflict that required military-style planning and professional security measures. How had her life become something that belonged in a crime novel rather than suburban Chicago? "I need to call my family," Isabella said suddenly, panic rising in her throat as she realized the full scope of Marcus's desperation. "If he's willing to hire people to kidnap me, what's to stop him from going after my sister?" "My parents?" "Already handled," Dante said gently, his hand coming to rest on her shoulder with reassuring warmth. "Your sister has been moved to a secure location, and your parents are under discreet protection. Hoffman won't be able to use your family as leverage." The casual way he spoke about mobilizing protection for people he'd never met, the resources and manpower required for such an operation, reminded Isabella once again of exactly what world she'd entered when she'd accepted Dante's help. This wasn't just about one man's wealth or influence. This was about an organization, a family, with the kind of reach and power that could protect people across multiple states without breaking stride. "Thank you," she whispered, meaning it more than she could express. Dante's expression softened slightly as he looked down at her. "You don't thank family for doing what family does," he said quietly, and the casual way he included her in that designation made her heart race with emotions too complex to name. The next hour passed in a blur of strategic planning and logistical coordination that felt surreal in its efficiency. Phone calls were made to contacts in Las Vegas and other cities, Information was gathered about Marcus's movements and associations, and plans were laid with the kind of thoroughness that spoke of extensive experience in handling similar situations. Isabella found herself relegated to observer status, watching with growing fascination and horror as Dante's organization swung into action around her. These weren't the movie stereotypes of crude criminals and thuggish enforcers. These were intelligent, educated professionals who handled violence and intimidation with the same business-like competence other people brought to corporate mergers or real estate transactions. The most shocking part was how normal they all seemed. Marco cracked jokes between status reports. Sophia offered coffee and homemade biscotti like this was a family dinner rather than a planning session for what amounted to a small war. Another cousin, introduced to Isabella as Tommy, discussed surveillance routes and exit strategies while simultaneously coordinating his daughter's soccer carpool schedule. "This is your world," Isabella said to Dante during a brief lull in the activity, her voice carefully neutral. "This is what you do." "Part of it," Dante replied honestly. "We have legitimate businesses too, investments and real estate and import operations that are completely legal. But yes, sometimes we handle problems that can't be solved through conventional channels." The admission should have terrified her, should have sent her running for the safety of police protection or witness relocation or any of the other options that normal people pursued when their lives were threatened by dangerous criminals. But sitting in Dante's living room, surrounded by people who were risking their own safety to protect her and her family, Isabella realized that she felt safer here than she had anywhere else in months. These people, whatever else they might be, had shown her more loyalty and care in 2 days than Marcus had in 8 months of supposed devotion. "I love you," she said suddenly, the words spilling out before she could second-guess them. The room went quiet around them, conversation stopping as everyone present became aware of the magnitude of what she'd just declared. But Isabella kept her eyes fixed on Dante's face, watching as his expression shifted from surprise to something that looked like overwhelming relief and joy. "I love you too," he said simply, his voice rough with emotion. "More than I thought I was capable of loving anyone." The declaration hung between them like a promise and a commitment, and a declaration of war all rolled into one. Because loving Dante Romano meant accepting everything that came with him, the danger and the power and the family that would kill to protect their own. "Isabella," Sophia said gently, drawing her attention back to the larger situation. "You need to understand what accepting this life means. What loving him means. There will always be people who want to hurt Dante by hurting the people he cares about. There will always be risks." "I know," Isabella replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "But there are risks everywhere, aren't there? I thought I was safe with Marcus because he was respectable and successful and seemed so normal. But he was the one who hurt me, who made me afraid to exist in my own life. At least here, the danger comes from outside instead of inside my own home." Dante's hand found hers then, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that felt like a promise. "You'll never have to be afraid in your own home again," he said quietly. "Not as long as I'm alive to prevent it." The vow was interrupted by the sharp buzzing of Marco's phone. He answered with his usual efficiency, but Isabella could see his expression growing progressively darker as he listened to whoever was on the other end. "Boss," Marco said when he ended the call. "Hoffman's made contact. He wants to meet, just him and Isabella. Says he has information about the people he hired that she needs to hear." The obvious trap was so transparent that Isabella almost laughed at Marcus's desperation. Did he really think she was stupid enough to meet with him alone after everything that had happened? "It's obviously a setup," Sophia said, voicing what everyone in the room was thinking. "He's gotten desperate enough to try something stupid." "Agreed," Dante said calmly. "Which means we're going to give him exactly what he wants, but not the way he expects it." The plan they developed was elegant in its simplicity. Isabella would agree to meet Marcus at the location of his choosing, but she wouldn't be alone. Dante's people would be positioned throughout the area with full surveillance and immediate response capabilities. Marcus would get his confrontation, but it would be the last one he ever attempted. 2 hours later, Isabella found herself sitting in her car in the parking lot of a restaurant on the outskirts of Chicago, waiting for Marcus to arrive and trying to control the mixture of fear and anticipation coursing through her system. She could see Marco positioned near the restaurant entrance and knew that Tommy was somewhere behind her with a clear line of sight to her car. Dante himself was in the restaurant, close enough to intervene immediately if anything went wrong. The late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the asphalt when Marcus's familiar BMW pulled into the lot and parked 3 spaces away from her. For a moment, neither of them moved, and Isabella found herself studying his profile through their respective car windows, trying to reconcile this desperate, dangerous version of Marcus with the successful lawyer she'd thought she'd fallen in love with a lifetime ago. When he finally emerged from his car and approached hers, Isabella could see the toll the past few days had taken on him. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled, and his hair uncombed. But it was his eyes that truly alarmed her, bright with the kind of manic energy that suggested someone pushed far beyond rational thought. Isabella rolled down her window but didn't get out of the car, following Dante's careful instructions about maintaining escape routes and defensive positioning. "Hello, Marcus," she said quietly. "Bella," Marcus said, and his use of the nickname that had once seemed endearing now made her skin crawl. "God, I've missed you. This has all been such a terrible misunderstanding." The attempt to reframe reality was so absurd that Isabella almost felt sorry for him. Had he really convinced himself that hiring kidnappers and threatening her family was just a misunderstanding? How completely had he lost touch with reality? "It's not a misunderstanding, Marcus," Isabella said firmly. "You threatened me, you harassed my family, and you tried to have me kidnapped. This isn't about miscommunication. This is about you being unwilling to accept that our relationship is over." Marcus's expression shifted then, the fake remorse dropping away to reveal something uglier underneath. "You think that criminal is going to keep you?" he snarled, his voice rising. "You think a man like Dante Romano gives a damn about some nobody graphic designer beyond what he can get from you?" The words were designed to hurt, to reopen every wound of insecurity and self-doubt Marcus had so carefully cultivated during their relationship. But sitting in her car with the knowledge that Dante loved her, that he'd mobilized his entire organization to protect her and her family, Isabella found that Marcus's cruelty had lost its power to wound. "What Dante and I have is none of your business," she said calmly. "What you need to understand is that your threats and intimidation aren't working anymore. I'm not coming back to you, Marcus. It's over." The rejection hit him like a physical blow, and Isabella could see the exact moment when his remaining self-control finally snapped completely. His face went red with rage, his hands clenched into fists, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the kind of ugly threats she'd learned to fear. "You stupid bitch," Marcus snarled. "Do you think I'm just going to let you walk away? After everything I invested in you? You belong to me, and if I can't have you, I'll make sure nobody else can either." He was reaching into his jacket when Dante appeared behind him like a shadow made flesh, moving with the kind of lethal grace that reminded Isabella exactly why Marcus should have been terrified rather than angry. The confrontation was over before it truly began. Marcus disarmed and on his knees in the parking lot with an efficiency that spoke of extensive training and absolute competence. The gun Marcus had been reaching for lay on the asphalt between them, and Isabella felt a chill of horror as she realized how close she'd come to real violence. If Dante hadn't been watching, if his timing had been even slightly off, Marcus might have actually succeeded in hurting her. "You made a serious mistake, Marcus," Dante said conversationally, though there was nothing casual about the way he maintained control over the larger man. Threatening Isabella was bad enough, but pulling a weapon? That requires a very different kind of response. What happened next was swift and decisive and completely final. Isabella didn't see all of it, didn't want to see all of it, but when it was over, Marcus Hoffman was no longer a threat to anyone. The man who had terrorized and controlled her for 8 months was simply gone. His reign of fear ended as efficiently and permanently as Dante's organization could manage. Later, back in the safety of the penthouse, Isabella found herself crying again, but this time the tears were from relief rather than fear. The nightmare was finally over. Marcus would never threaten her again, never try to isolate her from people who loved her, never make her feel small and worthless and lucky to be tolerated. "You're safe now," Dante murmured against her hair as he held her close. "It's finished, Isabella. He can't hurt you anymore." "I know," she whispered back. And I know what it cost you to make sure of that. What it cost all of you. Dante pulled back to look at her then, his storm gray eyes serious and intent. It cost nothing, he said firmly. Protecting the people we love isn't a cost, it's a privilege. It's what family does. The word family sent warmth spiraling through her chest, and Isabella realized that somewhere between yesterday's rescue and tonight's final confrontation, she'd found something she'd never expected to find. Not just love, though that was certainly part of it, but belonging. A place where she was valued and protected and cherished exactly as she was. What happens now? She asked softly. Now, Dante said, his smile warm and full of promise, we build a life together. You keep designing beautiful things. I keep protecting the people I love, and we figure out how to be happy together despite all the reasons we probably shouldn't work. The honest acknowledgement of their differences, of the challenges they'd face, made Isabella love him even more. This wasn't a fairy tale romance where love conquered all obstacles without effort. This was real life, messy and complicated and dangerous, but also full of the kind of deep, abiding connection she'd never thought she deserved. I love you, Dante Romano, she said, making it a promise and a commitment and a choice all at once. And I love you, Isabella Chun, he replied, sealing the vow with a kiss that tasted like forever and safety and the kind of love that was worth fighting for. Outside the penthouse windows, Chicago glittered in the darkness, and somewhere in the city, life went on for people who had no idea that a small war had been fought and won in their midst. But inside the warm sanctuary of their love, Isabella and Dante began planning a future that would be built on trust and protection and the unshakable knowledge that some things were worth risking everything to defend. 3 months later, Isabella stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows of what had become their home, watching the sun rise over Lake Michigan while coffee brewed in the kitchen behind her. The penthouse no longer felt like Dante's space that she was borrowing. Somewhere between her art covering the previously bare walls and her design books filling the shelves and her laughter echoing through rooms that had once been austere and lonely, it had become truly theirs. Her graphic design business had not only survived the chaos of leaving Marcus, it had thrived beyond anything she'd dared to imagine. Word had spread through Chicago's business community about her work, and she suspected that some of her new clients had connections to the Romano family. But the designs she created were entirely her own. Success felt different when it was built on talent and hard work rather than constantly walking on eggshells to avoid criticism. The sound of Dante's footsteps on the hardwood floors made her smile before she turned around. Even after 3 months of waking up beside him, of building a life together that felt both surreal and completely natural, her heart still raced when he walked into a room. "Good morning, beautiful," he said, his voice still rough with sleep as he wrapped his arms around her from behind, pressing a kiss to the curve of her neck that made her pulse flutter. "Good morning yourself," Isabella replied, leaning back into his warmth and strength. "Your sister called last night after you fell asleep. She wants to know if we're free for dinner Sunday. Apparently Tommy's wife is making her famous lasagna." Family dinners had become a regular part of their lives, and Isabella had been shocked to discover how much she enjoyed being surrounded by the loud, affectionate chaos of the Romano clan. These people who could be ruthlessly dangerous in their professional lives were devoted to each other with the kind of fierce loyalty she'd never experienced before. "Did you tell her yes?" Dante asked, though they both knew Isabella never turned down Sophia's invitations. His sister had appointed herself Isabella's guide to Romano family culture, and their friendship had become one of the unexpected gifts of Isabella's new life. "Of course I did," Isabella said, turning in his arms to face him properly. "Though I'm still not used to being included in everything so automatically. It's like you all decided I belonged here before I even figured out if I wanted to stay." "Do you?" Dante asked quietly, his storm gray eyes searching her face with the kind of intensity that still made her breath catch. "Want to stay, I mean? Even knowing what comes with this life, what it means to be part of this family." The question was asked lightly, but Isabella could hear the vulnerability underneath it. 3 months of happiness didn't erase a lifetime of being taught that people left, that love was temporary, that protection came with prices too high to pay. But Isabella had learned something important about Dante Romano in their time together. Underneath all his power and danger and carefully maintained control, he needed reassurance that he was worth staying for just as much as she needed to learn she was worth protecting. Every day, she said simply, rising on her toes to kiss him with all the love and certainty and fierce devotion she'd learned to feel. Every single day, I choose to stay. I choose this life, this family, this beautiful, complicated, dangerous love we've built together. The effect of her words on him was immediate and overwhelming. His arms tightened around her. His mouth found hers with desperate gratitude. And for several minutes the sunrise and coffee and breakfast plans were forgotten in favor of reaffirming their connection in the most elemental way possible. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Dante rested his forehead against hers with a smile that transformed his usually serious features into something young and hopeful and infinitely tender. "Isabella-chun," he said quietly, "will you marry me?" The words hung in the air between them, simple and profound, and completely unexpected despite the fact that they'd been building toward this moment for months. Isabella's heart stopped, then started again with a rhythm that felt entirely new. "What?" she whispered, not quite believing what she'd heard. Dante pulled back to look at her properly, his hands coming up to frame her face with reverent care. "I know it's soon. I know this world is complicated and dangerous and not what you planned for your life. But I love you, Isabella. I love your strength and your creativity and the way you laugh at Sophia's terrible jokes. I love the way you make this place feel like home instead of just a beautiful prison. I love who I am when I'm with you." His voice was rough with emotion, and Isabella could see her own wonder and joy reflected in his eyes. "I want to spend the rest of my life protecting you and cherishing you and watching you create beautiful things," Dante continued. "I want to give you children who will grow up knowing they're safe and loved and never have to be afraid in their own homes. I want to grow old with you and argue about what color to paint the kitchen and worry about normal things like whether our daughter is dating boys who are good enough for her." The picture he painted, of a future filled with love and safety and ordinary concerns rather than survival and fear, was so beautiful it made Isabella's eyes fill with tears. "Say yes," Dante whispered, his thumbs brushing gently across her cheekbones. "Say you'll marry me and let me spend the rest of my life proving that you deserve every happiness the world can offer." Isabella's answer came without hesitation, without doubt, without any of the careful calculation that had governed her decisions for so long. "Yes," she said, laughing through her tears as joy bubbled up from some deep well inside her chest. "Yes, Dante, of course I'll marry you. I love you so much it scares me sometimes." The kiss that followed was celebration and promise and seal all rolled into one. And when Dante finally pulled back to slip a ring onto her finger that he'd apparently been carrying around waiting for the right moment, Isabella felt like her life was finally, completely, perfectly whole. The ring was beautiful, a classic solitaire that caught the morning light and threw rainbows across the walls, but it was what it represented that made Isabella's heart race with happiness. Security, yes, but also choice. Partnership built on mutual respect rather than control. Love that enhanced rather than diminished the people it touched. The next 2 months passed in a blur of wedding planning that was surprisingly joyful despite the complexity of merging Isabella's small family with the extensive Romano network. Her parents, once they recovered from the shock of learning their daughter was marrying into organized crime, found themselves charmed by Dante's old-world courtesy and obvious devotion to their daughter. Her sister Lily, now safely returned to Northwestern with discreet protection that would continue until she graduated, appointed herself maid of honor and threw herself into wedding preparations with the kind of enthusiasm that reminded Isabella why she'd missed her so much. Sophia handled the logistical challenges with the kind of efficiency that came from years of managing family events that required balancing legitimate guests with people who couldn't appear in photographs for legal reasons. The result was a wedding that was both intimate and spectacular, held in the garden of the Romano family estate with Lake Michigan providing a stunning backdrop. As Isabella walked down the aisle toward Dante, her father's arms steady and supportive beside her, she found herself thinking about the woman she'd been just 5 months earlier. Scared, isolated, convinced she was lucky to be tolerated rather than cherished. That woman could never have imagined this moment, this love, this future full of possibility rather than fear. Dante stood waiting for her at the altar wearing a black tuxedo that emphasized his powerful build and made his gray-green eyes look like storm clouds full of lightning. But it was his expression that made her breath catch, the wonder and joy and absolute devotion that transformed his usually controlled features into something that belonged in Renaissance paintings about divine love. When her father placed her hand in Dante's, Isabella felt the last of her old fears finally dissolve. This was what love was supposed to feel like. Not walking on eggshells and constantly apologizing for existing, but being celebrated and cherished and protected by someone who saw her true worth. The ceremony was beautiful but simple, focusing on promises that mattered more than elaborate rituals. When Dante vowed to love and protect her for the rest of his life, to be her partner and supporter and safe harbor in any storm, Isabella felt like she was finally coming home after years of being lost. When she promised to love him without trying to change him, to be his sanctuary and his strength and his reminder that he deserved happiness just as much as the people he protected, she saw tears gather in his eyes despite his efforts to maintain composure. The kiss that sealed their marriage was witnessed by two families who had somehow become one, by friends and allies who understood that love was worth fighting for, by children who would grow up knowing that true protection came from devotion rather than dominance. 1 year later, Isabella stood in the same spot by the windows of their home, one hand resting on her growing belly while she watched Dante in the garden below, playing with their nephew and laughing with the kind of unguarded joy she'd never imagined he was capable of when they first met. Her design business had expanded beyond her wildest dreams. With a team of talented artists working from a studio space Dante had helped her establish in a renovated warehouse downtown. She'd found her voice again, her creativity flowing freely without the constant undercurrent of anxiety that had marked her work for so many months. The baby kicked against her palm, and Isabella smiled as she realized how excited she was to meet this little person who would grow up surrounded by the kind of fierce, protective love she'd found with the Romano family. Their child would never know what it felt like to be afraid in their own home, never doubt their worth or question whether they deserved to be loved. The sound of the front door opening announced Dante's return from the garden, and Isabella turned to watch him approach with the same flutter of excitement she'd felt from the very beginning. "How are my girls today?" he asked, his hands coming to rest on her belly with the careful reverence he'd shown throughout her pregnancy. "We're perfect," Isabella replied honestly. "Completely, absolutely perfect." As Dante kissed her with the same passion and tenderness that had marked their relationship from the beginning, Isabella marveled at how far they'd both traveled from that terrifying night in the restaurant when a stranger's intervention had changed the course of her entire life. Sometimes salvation really did come from the most unexpected places, in the most dangerous packages. Sometimes the person who looked like trouble turned out to be the answer to prayers you'd been too afraid to voice. Sometimes love meant learning that being protected wasn't the same as being controlled, that real strength came from partnership rather than dominance. If you're watching this story and recognizing pieces of your own life in Isabella's fear, in her isolation, in her desperate hope that love could look different than what she'd been accepting, please know that it can. Real love doesn't require you to become smaller. Real protection doesn't demand you give up your voice. Real partnership builds you up rather than tearing you down. Trust your instincts. Reach out to people who care about you. And remember that you deserve to be cherished exactly as you are, flaws and fears and all. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is stay where you are rather than risk the unknown. Sometimes the stranger offering protection is exactly the lifeline you've been waiting for. Love shouldn't hurt. Safety shouldn't require you to disappear. And happiness, real lasting happiness, is always worth fighting for. In the warm sanctuary of their love, surrounded by family who would move heaven and earth to protect each other, Isabella and Dante continued building a life that proved every day that some fairy tales were worth rewriting, some risks were worth taking, and some kinds of love really could conquer all.